Everyone, I would like to welcome you here to the Rockefeller Institute of Government. My name is Laura Schultz. I'm the Executive Director of Research here at the Institute. I want to thank our audience, both in person and those of you logging on to the website today, for joining us. We're excited here at the Institute to be partnering with the League of Women Voters of New York and the Brennan Center for Justice. We think it's important to share this information on small donor public financing and to facilitate a conversation on campaign finance reform in New York State. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping issues. Please note that the fire exits are on your right, my left. Restrooms are located downstairs on the first floor of the lobby. And finally, please take a minute to just silence your cell phones. I would now like to introduce Laura Bierman, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters in New York State, to kick off the program.
Hello. As she said, I'm Laura Bierman. I'm Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of New York State. The League is a nonpartisan membership organization with 42 local leagues across New York State and 700 across the country. We advocate for many issues which we have studied and agreed upon with our members. In 1974, the National League adopted the following position. The League of Women Voters of the United States believes that the methods of financing political campaigns should ensure the public's right to know, combat corruption and undue influence, enable candidates to compete more equitably in public office, and allow maximum citizen participation in the political process. We have fought for campaign finance reform since then, and at least as early as 1985, we advocated for public financing for campaigns. Partial public financing was introduced each session as early as 1985, and it often passed the Assembly. The New York City system for public financing of elections was implemented in 1988. Clean Money, Clean Elections was a campaign introduced into the 1998 legislative session. And since the early 2000s, the League supported legislation to create a voluntary system of public finance modeled after the New York City system. This is not a new issue for the League or for New York State. We have a successful program to model and a public who would like change. Today, we have a discussion on the details of the public financing system that was enacted in 2020. We hope that this program will be successful for the 2024 elections. Our speakers today are from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Joanna Zdanys serves as senior counsel in the Brennan Center's Elections and Government program. Her work focuses on advancing reforms in the area of money and politics. Joanna provides policy advice to lawmakers across the country and has testified before state and local legislators. Before joining the Brennan Center, Joanna clerked for Honorable Lashane D'Arcy Hall in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York. Joanna earned her JD from Fordham University School of Law, where she was editor-in-chief of the Fordham Urban Law Journal and a Stein Scholar for Public Interest. Hazel Millard is the advocacy campaign strategist in the Brennan Center's Elections and Government program. She focuses on the areas of money and politics and election administration. Hazel collaborates with coalition partners in New York State on advocacy strategies to advance democracy reform. She also has authored several Brennan Center reports, and her work has been featured in local and national media. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Hazel graduated summa cum laude from Middlebury College with a bachelor's degree in history. Following their presentation today, Erica Smitka, Deputy Director of the League, will moderate the Q&A. So let's welcome Hazel and Joanna.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Laura, Erica, and Millie from the League for organizing this event, and Laura and the team here at the Rockefeller Institute for hosting us. Like Laura said, my name is Hazel Millard. I'm an advocacy campaign strategist at the Brennan Center for Justice, and I'm joined by my colleague, Joanna Zdanys, senior counsel at the Brennan Center. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works on issues of democracy, justice, and liberty and national security. Joanna and I work closely together on money and politics issues, including and especially here in New York State. This work addresses a political system where a small group of wealthy, predominantly white and male donors disproportionately influence our elections and the policies that our government makes. This system creates a socioeconomically and racially unrepresentative donor base. It privileges large donors' policy preferences, which we know are often out of line with the preferences of most Americans. And it also creates barriers to entry for candidates without ties to wealth. This simply isn't how our democracy is supposed to work. And so our work encompasses a variety of sub-issues, but our talk today is going to focus on our signature policy of small donor public financing, a reform through which candidates run their campaigns powered by public funds and the support of small dollar constituents instead of collecting large contributions from wealthy donors. So this is a policy that the Brennan Center has worked on for decades and across the country in many jurisdictions. And we're hoping you'll walk away from this talk understanding more about New York State's new public financing program and why we think it stands to be the strongest model we've seen yet. We'll start by talking about how the influence imbalance in our elections got to be so bad in the first place, and walk through a few examples of recent elections that illustrate it. We'll then talk about growing support for public campaign financing across the country and in New York before looking at New York's new program more closely. Before diving into our presentation, we want to note that for those of you who are potentially interested in participating in the New York State program, this talk is not meant to be a replacement for the Public Campaign Finance Board's monthly public information sessions. Those sessions provide a much deeper dive for candidates, potential candidates, people who want to know more about the ins and outs of participating in the program. And I believe their next one is Tuesday, March 14th at 10 a.m. So I encourage you all, or anyone who's interested, to check that out at pcfb.my.gov. So to take a step back and understand why we think public financing of elections is such an important tool for our campaign finance system, for reforming our campaign finance system, I think it helps to take a closer look at the legal context and the moment we're responding to. In recent decades, as many of you probably know, the US Supreme Court has systematically dismantled state and federal campaign finance laws in a line of deregulatory decisions. Most notably in 2010, Citizens United versus FEC paved the way for unprecedented levels of election spending. That decision struck down limits on quote unquote independent spending by corporations and other entities with the reasoning that money that doesn't go directly to candidates doesn't pose a risk of corrupting them. This gave way to the creation of super PACs, which are entities that allow wealthy donors and special interests to spend unlimited amounts of money on elections, so long as these groups, super PACs, do not coordinate with a candidate or their campaign. In the last 13 years since Citizens United, according to analysis by Open Secrets, over $9 billion, with a B, dollars have been spent by super PACs and outside spenders on federal elections. This was all happening at the same time as the court has repeatedly actually upheld the democratic value of public financing programs and also upheld their constitutional validity. So this makes public financing what we believe to be the most effective, longest studied, and constitutionally permissible solution that we have available to empower small donors in the face of, the massive spending we're seeing in elections. So I wanted to share some pretty staggering numbers about the elections that concluded last year. So the 2022 midterm elections were the most expensive in US history. $16.7 billion, again, with a B, was spent on all state and federal races, again, per an analysis by Open Secrets. What's significant here isn't just the amount of money that was spent, although that is pretty significant. It's the fact that just a small handful of ultra wealthy mega donors were responsible for a significant chunk of those funds. For federal races, just 100 wealthy donors outspent 3.7 million small donors by 60%. And those mega donors often enabled extremist election denying candidates who we saw rise to prominence over the last year or more. And it was especially concerning to see those candidates running for offices that oversee our elections. And New York is no exception. We also saw that wealthy donors have a grossly outsized role in our elections here in New York in 2022. In 2022, candidates running for state elections in New York raised just over $104.8 million. And just 200 of the wealthiest donors outspent more than 206,000 small donors by $2 million. So again, we're seeing a really small group of people have a lot of influence on our elections, both in New York and at the federal level. So reasonably, I think people are fed up with this status quo where, big donors kind of rule the day. And there's real appetite for reform. So a recent survey by the Pew Research Center found that reducing the influence of money in politics was among the top 5 priorities for all Americans. And this was consistent across demographics, including race, age, and political party affiliation. The same is true in New York. A poll released last month by Data for Progress found that more than 9 in 10 voters here in New York, or 91%, believe wealthy donors have an outsized influence on politicians compared to the average voter. That poll also found that 70% of New York voters want their elected officials to prioritize countering the influence of wealthy donors in politics. And again, that included a majority of donors, both across demographics like race, age, and political party, as well as across regions throughout the state. So recent passage of small donor public financing programs in jurisdictions across the country is another way we can kind of look at this momentum that we're talking about. Since 2010, when Citizens United, that decision came down, over a dozen jurisdictions have either adopted the reform or strengthened existing programs. From Seattle to Washington, D.C. and its surrounding counties, and most notably here in New York State. This is a tried and true reform that can effectively counter the impact of big spending in our elections. Before we talk more about New York's program, I want to talk a little bit about the impact that these small donor public financing programs have had elsewhere in the country. For example, we know that public financing helps candidates run on grassroots support, even in situations with a lot of spending from special interests. Take what happened in Seattle in 2019. These are some of the headlines that we saw in both local and national outlets at the time. Amazon, which is based there, and many other big corporations spent millions in favor of a slate of pro-business candidates who are running for city council in Seattle at the time. And however, despite this historic level of spending, publicly financed candidates won 4 of the 6 races where you saw businesses pouring millions in favor of their business-friendly candidates. Public financing also increases small donor and constituent involvement in elections. Data from Berkeley, California's first elections with public financing in 2018 show a big drop in the average contribution size raised by candidates from nearly $200 to $78. The 2018 elections also saw more small donor participation from every zip code in the city, not just the wealthy white neighborhoods that typically you see higher donor participation from. We've seen similar results from public financing programs in Seattle, Montgomery County, Maryland, and New York City as well. Many of you are probably most familiar with New York City's small donor matching program. Several years ago, the Brennan Center did a study comparing how much New York City Council candidates running under that program relied on constituents for funding their campaigns compared to assembly candidates who didn't have public financing available to them at the time. And the reason we did this comparison was because, at least under the maps that were available at the time, there were 21 city council districts that overlapped almost exactly with assembly districts. So we were able to look at how donors in the same area responded to different types of candidates and campaigns, publicly financed and privately financed. So we found that publicly financed council candidates raised significantly more funds from small donors than their privately financed candidates, which you can see here. The light blue wedge on the pie is small donor funding. We also found that public financing serves to strengthen the ties between candidates and the voters they seek to serve, with publicly financed candidates raising more from small donors in their districts than the privately financed counterparts. And we know that New Yorkers are eager to see these benefits in their own state. In that same poll that I mentioned earlier from Data for Progress, 61% of voters expressed their support for New York's new public financing program. And again, notably, majorities in every region of the state continue to support the program, even after reading messaging both in favor and against it. And finally, nearly 2/3 of voters in New York expressed support for funding the program this year to make sure that it can run as intended. So I'm going to hand the mic off to Joanna, who is going to dive more into what this reform can mean for our state.
Yeah, thanks so much, Hazel. So I'm Joanna Zdanys. I'm senior counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. And before I go on, I just want to extend my thanks to our hosts at the Rockefeller Institute and the League of Women Voters for having us. And if you'll bear with me for 1 second, I just want to say that I love partnering and doing events with the League because I credit them for sort of my own entry into civic awareness and working on democracy issues. I was a member of my hometown's Junior League of Women Voters more than 20 years ago. So I'm always grateful for the opportunity to continue to engage with such a wonderful organization. So you've heard some of the bad news from us about the significant problems that Citizens United caused, and also the appetite for addressing that both in New York and across the country. So now let's talk a little bit more about this great program and the solution to some of these ills. So as Hazel said, the state legislature passed and our state enacted a system of small donor public financing back in 2020. But it was a long time coming, for years, as Laura was saying in her introductory remarks, folks across the state and including our partners in the Fair Elections for New York Coalition, some of whom are in the audience today, and elections experts, civic leaders, editorial boards, and concerned citizens had called on our state's leaders to bring public financing to New York. Some of you might recall that the state came very close to passing this kind of system about a decade ago. And then there was renewed momentum around 2019. At that point, the governor and legislature established a commission to study public campaign financing and propose the details of a program. And that commission held hearings across the state, and its findings were ultimately enacted into law in April of 2020. And just to put that against the national backdrop, that happened at a time where there was also momentum for campaign finance reform on the national scale. Congress attempted, but ultimately failed to bring a similar reform. There was a multiple match small donor public financing system that was part of a bill known as HR 1 that was introduced back in 2019. It came very close, but didn't make it over the finish line last year in the Federal Freedom to Vote Act, narrowly defeated because of dysfunction that our presentation won't go into today. But it is really worth thinking about how this system for New York is accomplishing something and setting a national model at a time where more broadly this reform that has been called for so broadly has not been able to come to pass in other contexts. So New York's program went into effect last November of 2022. And so even now, candidates who are running in the 2024 legislative elections and 2026 statewide can opt in and begin to participate. And so I'm going to go over some of the very basic nuts and bolts to give some of you who are less familiar programs with a sense of how it works. I realize we've kind of come this far in our program without talking about what exactly public financing is and does. But like Hazel said, for those of you who want to go deeper into the weeds, the public information sessions by the PCFB are a fabulous resource. So just to go into some of the broad strokes, some of you might be familiar with other prominent matching programs like New York City's, as Laura had mentioned before. That's one that's been in place for more than 30 years. New York State's program is one that we see as really building on the tried and true features of programs like New York City's that have operated for so long with great success. But the program imports important new innovations that are responsive to the current era of campaign finance that we're living in and the realities of campaigning in this post-Citizens United world. So just to start off on the very basics of the program, I want to stress that it's completely voluntary. So this isn't a program that everyone is required to opt into, but those who do and who qualify to participate are eligible to receive public matching funds. It applies to statewide offices, including governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and comptroller, and then Senate and Assembly. So not just anyone can receive matching funds. This is not the state issuing a blank check to candidates across the state. To receive public matching funds, candidates have to get a place on the ballot for the office that they're campaigning for. And they also have to meet a two-part fundraising threshold. And that's made up of a minimum dollar amount that candidates have to raise and a minimum number of small donations from small donor constituents. And that is intended to show a baseline of support among the community that they're seeking to serve and show their viability as a candidate. These thresholds, as you can see, vary by the office in question. It's highest for candidates running for governor. So someone running for governor would have to raise $500,000, including at least 5,000 matchable contributions. And I'll illustrate what that means in just a moment. A Senate candidate, in contrast, would have to raise $12,000 from within their district, including at least 150 matchable contributions. A matchable contribution is one that's between $5 and $250 from an eligible donor. So for statewide candidates, that means a New York resident. And for legislative candidates, that means from someone who resides within the district. And these are two of the features that we're really enthusiastic about for this program because it incentivizes empowering small donors who traditionally have been left out, and also strengthening ties between candidates and the communities that they're seeking to serve. Just looking back to the study that Hazel had mentioned before about the constituent engagement effect that these types of program really promote. New York's program, I think by design, is poised to enable that benefit to really proliferate across the state. This program also has an important feature that considers the socioeconomic diversity of the state. There are pockets of the state where it could be really challenging for someone to reach these dollar amount thresholds because their constituents might not have a disposable $10 or $20 to give. And so in districts with a lower median income, so of course this only applies to Senate and Assembly races, the dollar amount of the qualifying thresholds is reduced somewhat to account for that reality, but the number of contributions that they have to receive remains the same. And again, that is to reinforce the importance of having actual support in the community. So how does the match actually work? It depends that the match amount is calculated differently for statewide and legislative candidates. So eligible candidates for statewide offices will receive a match of 6-to-1 on contributions of $250 or less from residents of the state. And so, for example, if a New York resident gave $10 to a participating candidate, who had qualified to participate in the program, that would be matched at a 6-to-1 rate, so with $60. So at the end of the day, the total value of a $10 contribution to the candidate with that additional $60 would become $70. For legislative candidates, this is where we see another one of the program's real innovations. Contributions of up to $250 are matched on a sliding scale based on their size. So the first $50 of a contribution are matched at a 12-to-1 rate. The next $100 are matched at a 9-to-1 rate. And the last $100 will be matched 8-to-1. So for example, if an in-district donor gave a participating candidate $25, that would be matched 12-to-1 because it falls within that first tier of the sliding scale. And so with a match amount of $300, the total value of a $25 contribution would become worth $325 to the campaign. If that campaign received $100 from an in-district donor, then we would see the first kind of 2 tiers of the sliding scale come into play. So the first $50 would be matched 12-to-1. The second $50 would be matched at a 9-to-1 rate. And so all in, that $100 contribution would become worth $1,150 for the candidate. And just to further illustrate the point that if you got a $300 contribution from an out-of-district donor, it wouldn't be matched, both because it's over $250 and it's not from a constituent. And I just wanted to note there are a few other places around the country that have employed this sort of sliding scale system, including in some of the Maryland counties around DC. But New York's model is particularly innovative in providing the most meaningful match and the greatest sort of amplification of the smallest donation. So we think that this is the strongest model that we've seen of this tiered matching system across the country. So just to sum up where we see what we think some of the most important innovations of this program are, and I've already touched on them a bit, but together we think, there are a number of features that make this program a particularly robust response to the imbalance in our current political system that Hazel mentioned before. That includes the match of $250 only because it incentivizes candidates to engage with more small donors. The match on contributions from constituents only, which again helps candidates spend more time with the people that they're running to serve and strengthening ties between candidates in their community. And, from the campaign perspective, I think this is also a very important tool because they will be hoarding contributions the same way that they're seeking votes at the same time, reaching out with the community and having that time instead of having to do call time in their office and powering their campaigns that way. It really enables more of the interactions that also ultimately help connect candidates with the people that they're running to serve. And again, that sliding scale match is one of the more exciting aspects that we've seen of any of these models across the country. And then specifically, especially because we've been stressing the realities of Citizens United so much in this presentation, the way that the program is designed, I think, is especially responsive with these, the elements that I just mentioned combined, but also because the program allows candidates to continue raising and spending once they hit the maximum amount of funds that the program provides. I realize I didn't detail the limits under the program for how much money a candidate can receive under the program, but it's not unlimited. So there are statutory maximums for how much any given campaign can receive. It's based by office. But once a candidate receives the maximum amount of funding available under the program, they have the ability to continue to raise and spend contributions, private contributions, as long as they comply with the contribution limits that apply to their office. And we think that this is an important feature to respond to the reality of campaigning post Citizens United. Hazel described earlier how super PACs that make unlimited independent expenditures have become a growing presence in US politics. And some folks, even, supporters of public financing, have raised the concern of how can public financing work if it's potentially going to be swamped by outside spending. So I'll say, first of all, in reality, independent spending only targets a very small number of races. So in fact, as our recent analysis with Open Secrets showed, 75% of independent spending only targets about 10% of legislative races. But even under the occasional reality where outside expenditures become an issue for candidates, the program allows them to continue to fundraise, and simultaneously have powered their campaigns through small donors with the multiple match that the program offers. So we're also enthusiastic about the program because data analyses bear out that it really works. I mentioned before we did an analysis with Open Secrets. Professor Malvin, who is one of the co-authors of that study, is here today. We're grateful to have you here. But we partnered recently on an analysis of contribution data from the 2022 election cycle to project the impact of how this program would have worked, what the results would have been if it had been in place in last year's elections. And first of all, it really showed strikingly what a tiny role small donors currently have in fundraising in our state, and how much public financing would really flip that dynamic on its head. So we'll start with statewide candidates. Under the status quo without the public financing program, small donors made up only 6% of contributions. It's that tiny light blue sliver at the top. They made up only 6% of contributions to statewide candidates in 2022. Looking at the center pie, if the program had been in place, but small donor participation had remained the same, that share would have increased from 6% to 27%. But if there was increased small donor participation, which is reasonable to expect, looking to the experience of other jurisdictions and also the incentives that this program creates to engage more with small donors, if the candidates who had run for statewide had just doubled their small donor base, small donors could have made 41% of contributions to statewide candidates. And the numbers are even more striking in legislative races. So last year, without the matching funds program in place, small donors made up just 11% of contributions in the 2022 election cycle. But with that innovative tiered match system in place, with just the same number of small donors, their share of the pie would have increased to 53%. And with increased small donor participation, if legislative candidates had doubled their small donors, it could grow to as large as 67%. So we would see small donors again going from a tiny fraction to, in the context of legislative offices, becoming the most significant source of contributions to candidates. So we're going to wrap up the formal presentation. I'm just going to say, for all the reasons that Hazel and I have discussed, we have a lot of hope for the promise of New York's public financing program. And, as Hazel mentioned, we work on this issue across the country, and we're seeing a lot of excitement and attention to the program. And we think that it really stands to be a powerful model for reform for other states, for counties, for cities across the country to follow, and maybe one day the federal government will see. So thank you again to all of you for being here, for those of you who are here in the room, and also those who are joining virtually, and to our hosts. And we look forward to your questions. So I guess we'll kick it over to you, Erica.
Thank you so much to both. Thank you, Hazel. Thank you, Joanna. As Laura said, my name is Erica Smitka. I'm the Deputy Director with the League of Women Voters of New York State. And thank you also to the Rockefeller Institute for having us here today, as well as to those who have joined us online from across the state. So I'm going to kick us off with a few questions that I have for you both, and then I will hand it to the audience and to those joining us via Zoom. So my first question, and it's a question for you both, is what do you see as the next step for the program? And what do you hope to see in the budget?
Well, I think you might have answered part one of the question with part two of the question. We're in Albany in March, so I think you can all guess that, as this program takes off, we are very hopeful to see that the final budget reflects the resources that are necessary to power this program. That includes ensuring that the Public Campaign Finance Board gets the funds that it needs for administering the program, for having the staff and the resources necessary to work with campaigns to facilitate their participation and make sure that the necessary infrastructure is in place, and also to fund the matching funds that are going to go to candidates who choose to participate in the program. It's important to have this funding now to ensure that folks can start planning their campaigns. The 2024 legislative cycle is already underway. And so we saw Governor Hochul included $14.5 million for the PCFB to administer the program in her executive budget, as well as $25 million for matching funds. We know last year the Senate's one house included $40 million for matching funds, so we would certainly hope to see them maintain that commitment in the one houses, which I think should be coming out any day now. So we'll see, but yeah.
I'll just add, that is definitely what's next and what is most important to focus on, but also just continuing to spread the word about this program and the great work the PCFB is doing to train and prepare candidates. This is new for a lot of people, and it's an exciting new thing. But I don't know if that squeak is coming from me. Sorry. But yeah, I think we're excited to keep having these conversations. I know a lot of our partners in fair elections are as well. So I think that's also part of what comes next.
Absolutely. As a follow-up question to that, can you talk a little bit more about why it's so important that we see that funding in the budget now, this year?
Yeah, so, next year is the year when candidates will start seeing payments from the fund. But, as I said, folks are already opting into the program. They're devising their campaign strategies. They're figuring out, am I going to use the program? Am I going to be engaging with small donors and ensuring that that funding is there for them to be able to rely on? And also, I think the signal of support to a public that has long called for this program for all New Yorkers, a commitment that our leaders in Albany are serious about changing the status quo and really sealing this accomplishment, which has come along with, great advances in just the few years, public financing, along with major strides in voting rights, election administration reforms. It would be, I think, it's critical to continue that momentum and that public commitment to not turning back to the Albany that it used to be.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You got to see that investment up front to see it work well in the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my second question for you both is about something that's been brought up a few times here, both in Laura's opening remarks and you all mentioned it a little bit in your presentation. Could you speak more specifically to the differences between New York City's public campaign finance program and the New York State public campaign finance program?
Sure. So like I said before, there are a great deal of similarities between the programs, and that, New York State's program builds on the tried and true elements of, requiring candidates to demonstrate a baseline of support of their community by fundraising a threshold amount, the existence of a multiple match, and so on. So a lot of the contours are very similar, but there are some important departures. One of those, I mentioned that one of the elements that we're particularly enthusiastic about is the 250 only match, truly matching only small donations. New York City's program provides, that the first X amount, the first $250 of a donation up to the contribution limit, which is greater than that, will be matched at a multiple rate. We think, based on political differences between running for office in the city versus running for office in the state, and really the some of the other details of the program, including this tiered match, make it, first of all, just incredibly like a true small donor program in ways that New York City's is not as much, but really allows through that, particularly that tiered legislative multiple match, to create, competitive fundraising opportunities for candidates who opt to use it while still running on just a small contribution. I said before that one of the elements that's so responsive to the post-Citizens United world is the ability for candidates to continue to fundraising if need be outside of the system. New York City's program has expenditure limits. So once it says for X office, you can only spend so much money on your campaign. And that's something that, has worked in New York City. New York City's program has had a lot of success over the years, but given the era that we are in and, the dynamics of campaign fundraising, it is ever more important to ensure that campaigns won't feel disincentivized or have their hands tied in the event of a particularly competitive race where they may need to seek additional resources for their campaigns. And also one other thing is that in-district only match. So I guess I'm just like going through the list of everything we said was like particularly innovative about this program. But New York City's program allows candidates running, for city council to get a match from within the city itself, not necessarily just within the district. And we like New York State's model, again, because it really doubles down on constituent engagement and growing the ties between candidates and their communities.
Thanks, Joanna. All right, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Go ahead. Oh, well, then we've got a mic coming for you.
Thanks, but this is more of a statement than a question. So if you want me to sit down, I'll sit down. But may I say, this is the 50th anniversary this year of the Senate Watergate hearings. It's also the 50th anniversary of me writing about this subject, including about New York City, New York State, and so forth. I've been particularly proud to partner with the Brennan Center on some of the recent data that you talked about. I have been so excited about this program because it is, to me, it is the most exciting, the one that I have seen over all of these years, because it is the only one that ties fundraising directly to constituent representation. In the other races, they've been separate things. You go to the boardroom to raise your money, you go to the neighborhood to organize your. This means not only do you use raising incentives to strengthen the local constituency ties, but you build a bulwark against independent spending from the outside. It's exciting. We've written about it as a likely model for the nation, or as a possible model for the nation. It will only be that if it is implemented. So I think people need to be a little more aware, beaten over the head with the fact that there is a real threat right now. There have been press reports that the assembly candidates are worried legitimately that they won't know their new district lines for some time. And how can you raise money within your district if you don't know your district lines? Well, that'll give that, and they would like to postpone for 2 years. There's a very easy technical legislative fix that our studies with the numbers point to. All one needs to do is say, if you raise money within your old district lines, it can be matched. Then almost every single candidate will be much further ahead with the match than under the old system. We shouldn't. There's a legitimate concern, but not a legitimate basis for postponing what is a program that deserves to get off the ground, because it is the most innovative and thoughtful program anywhere. Period. That's not a question. I suppose I could say, do you agree?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that. Other questions from the audience? Yes, right back here.
Hi, this might be more of like a Tuesday question, but I think that I'm going to ask it anyway here. So I'm an interested voter and I want to make a small donation to someone that's running in my area. And let's say I am forgetful about what I've done. If I donate my $250 and then forget and they say something great and I want to donate like another $1, does that invalidate my match entirely?
So you wouldn't have to track that
I know,
as the donor, but my understanding, and I know that the PCFB will go into this more in their public information sessions, is that there are options to refund that excess. Yeah.
And then my follow-up to that is, like, if I wanted to run for office, you keep mentioning candidates opt into this program. What would be some reasons that candidates choose not to participate in the program? Because if I were running, I would say, great, give me free money.
Yeah, so I also do have to say, as a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, we're not able to give campaign advice. The only thing I say now is like only in terms of my own opinion, not advice to anyone running for political office. I think that different candidates choose to power their campaigns differently. I think sometimes it could be a lack of information that, about how to move forward with campaigns. I think first-time candidates often face a steeper learning curve than folks who have been running for longer. I think that's part of, what the PCFB's information sessions that they're holding are designed to address, to kind of go through the nuts and bolts and the steps of how to open an account, how to register as a candidate and things like that. But to your broader question of why not, I guess to look at the question slightly differently is one thing that we see about this program is that, it really opens doors to engaging with your future constituents so much more and with future voters so much more, but it's also completely voluntary. Like, it's meant to be a tool that's available to folks. But we've seen, just based on the participation in these programs across the country, like New York City, its most recent citywide elections, I think, saw more than 90% participation by candidates in their public campaign financing program. And so we do think, as these programs have proliferated across the country, like the early cycles don't see necessarily like that high of participation in it, but as folks learn more, as it becomes more of like the political culture, as folks kind of see its benefits and see how it helps them to run for office powered by small donor constituents, it becomes just more of the routine kind of reality of running for office.
90% is a pretty shocking statistic. That's great. That's really great to hear. Other questions from our audience, or? All right, I'll have right up here up front.
Oh, up front. Here, let me just jump in real quick and then we'll
Sure. Okay, we got one Zoom question.
Got a couple Zoom questions. So we actually have two questions that I think we can kind of consolidate into one, but they're both about details related to how the match works with in district. I know you went over this, but maybe we can go back to those slides. And I'll just quickly read these. So if an in-district contributor gives $260, does a match occur for the first $250, or is the entire $260 disqualified?
So I think this is in line with the previous question that we got. So again, this program only matches contributions up to $250. That's a limit for it to be matchable. It doesn't have to be $250 at one time. It could be like a bunch of $10 donations over time, something like that. But if a contributor goes over $250 in the aggregate, it won't be matched. That said, my understanding, and again, I would defer to the PCFB's informational public education materials on this, but there would be opportunities for candidates to decide whether they preferred to refund that overage so that they could retain the match for those contributions.
Okay, I think that answers the other question as well. So thank you.
All right, Kate.
This may be kind of in the weeds as well, but I was in Assemblyman Steck's office a couple of weeks ago, and he complained about the difficulties of an assembly member having a volunteer treasurer to manage the complexities of the public finance accounting. And I wondered if you had any comment on that. I'd like to know, is it more complex than New York City's, which also had small representatives? So I'm just wondering if it's so different that it becomes more onerous.
So I think this goes to our discussion earlier about the importance of the budget for this program and ensuring that the Public Campaign Finance Board gets the resources that it needs, because part of what that funding goes to is dedicated staff who are there to answer questions and assist candidates and their treasurers with complying. Everyone receives training. Every campaign that opts in receives training under the program. There are these public information sessions, but for more in the weeds questions, my understanding is that the agency is going to have folks on hand available to ask questions, and they're developing software for campaigns to be able to use to help them with sort of the accounting of the program.
Thanks for that question. Other questions from the audience?
Thank you. So in addition to the rumors for postponement relating to district lines, I've heard some talk of postponement just if it doesn't get the funding that it needs. Because some people might be worried that a poorly funded program might do more to hurt the movement and support for it than to help. So I wanted to ask you, would you prefer to see if the program remains underfunded, that it goes ahead with what it has, or postponed for another cycle?
We don't see any reason for this program to be postponed. It's already live, it's implemented. It launched last November. Candidates, most of whom are sitting office holders, have already opted in. You can see on the PCFB's website, there's a list of campaigns that have already opened up their accounts and folks who intend to run under the program. So no, we don't see any reason for this program to be delayed. We think it's ready to go, but again, ensuring that the agency has the money that it needs to continue its work to build out this very strong program for its first run, and to make sure that there are matching funds available so that candidates have that assurance that they can plan their campaigns around it, are really important. So.
I'll have you pass the microphone just in front of you to Orlando there. Oh, went back. Okay, we've got another question right here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm wondering if a candidate joins the program and then what happens, is there any specific criteria as to IEs, independent expenditures, once the candidate joins the program? For instance, we know that there's some labor that actually do some IEs once the campaign is getting to the home stretch. Will that have an impact? Is there any specific criteria as to that you can or cannot do? Just wondering.
Yeah, that's a great question.
So is your question what can candidates who are running under the program do to respond to if there's a lot of last minute?
Because there's some IEs that the candidate is not aware of,
Sure.
Or the campaign is not aware of. I mean, that is not supposed to be aware of, quote unquote. That's what I mean.
But yeah, exactly. And I think you're picking up on exactly what Hazel was talking about before, that independent expenditures are ostensibly supposed to be not coordinated with candidates, but we've seen numerous examples across the country of how candidates have been, more or less aware of IEs. So they're not, it takes the I out of the IE, I guess. But so, as far as whether or not candidates are aware of a particular independent expenditure, I guess that's such a case specific basis. But what this program allows campaigns to do is to have the resources that they need to be able to get their message out there and launch a competitive campaign based on being powered by their small donor constituents. And definitely no one's pretending that this program is going to quote unquote level the playing field. It's not going to mean that publicly financed candidates are going to have as much money as the big mega donor who's funding a big independent expenditure. But truly what matters, we think, is making sure that candidates have the resources that they need to be able to get their message out to their voters at the end of the day. And so with that really meaningful multiple match that the program gives on small contributions, candidates who make the decision to run under the system have that additional ability, the resources that they need to get that message out there to launch a competitive campaign, even in the wake of what you're talking about here, not knowing, is the message that's coming out a week before election day going to totally tank me? And again, it still does allow for additional fundraising as well. And this is, that's such a great point. And, it's another one of, I think those elements of, and just like the new realities of the political culture that we're living in now, that Citizens United and related cases have really brought about, it unleashed all this wealth. And now all of a sudden we're seeing, well, not all of a sudden, it's now been well over a decade, but the problem, persists, that you see just like tremendous expenditures seeking to influence, all the messages that voters are receiving. And, I'll say, folks always ask, well, like, why don't we just get rid of that? Why don't we just limit, why can't we get rid of self-funding candidates? Can't we limit these expenditures? And, the answer is, short of a new United States Supreme Court, no, we can't. Independent expenditures aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Unlimited wealth in our politics is not going anywhere anytime soon. But what we can do is provide this very powerful alternative that helps small donors who have just been absolutely drowned out of the conversation to actually have a more meaningful role in our politics.
That's a really important point, and giving a voice kind of back to the voters and the people who are going to be, again, voting for and looking to put someone in office that represents their views in their community. So absolutely.
Could I just add?
Yeah, go ahead.
That just reminded me of a study. But there, one of the things that we also often talk about with public financing is when people engage with a campaign or an election as a donor, they're much more likely to show up as a voter too. So I think there's also, we've been talking about this constituent engagement effect. We see it play out. So I just was thinking in that scenario where somebody has been pounding the pavement, collecting small donations from their neighbors for months, and then all of a sudden you have an IE campaign sending mailers or, ads. Hopefully the way this works, not to keep beating the same point, is, by nature of, pounding the pavement, talking to your neighbors, you've also built up a voter base that is motivated to go and turn out for you. So I just want to throw that out there, that there's been research into that as well.
Yeah, no, that's good. You really got that buy-in and people looking for an outcome for, what they've donated to. So thanks for that point, Hazel. We've got a question on Zoom here.
So as to embrace accountability, what are some of the oversight steps to ensure the integrity of dispersing the matching funds, i.e. audit procedures?
So again, I defer to the Public Campaign Finance Board on the specific ins and outs, but a lot of these procedures are baked into the law itself that created the program. Candidates have to submit disclosure reports to the Public Campaign Finance Board that detail their contributions and the expenditures that they make under the program. Those contributions are reviewed by staff, problems are flagged, of course, and candidates get notice and an opportunity to correct any issues that might come up. But there's an ongoing sort of quality control check review process, both, to check to see, has a candidate qualified for the program, and also are their donations matchable? And through that process, ideally any major red flags are identified before they become a big problem. And there are also limited kind of audit procedures after all statewide candidates under the law are audited after the campaign. And then a portion of legislative races also get a post-election audit. So that ensures the integrity of the process while also ensuring that it's a fair process that gives candidates notice and an opportunity to correct any deficiencies.
I'll just piggyback on that to repeat something Joanna said earlier, which is this is also, there's the post-election auditing process, but there's also the work that the PCFB is doing to help candidates before all of that stuff throughout the process to make sure that they are submitting the right forms and doing all that good stuff. So again, that's why it's very important that this program is funded and supported right now and implemented. And so I just want to bring that point up, that that's also part of enforcement and oversight.
Thanks, Hazel. Definitely a system with a lot of layers, right? Other questions from the audience?
So that another question from Zoom, and
Sure.
Not expect you to know the exact URL here, but someone is looking for guidance on how to find the list of participating candidates on the PCFB website. So is that an easy place to navigate to?
Yeah, well, the PCFB's website is pcfb.ny.gov. And I can't tell you the exact URL beyond that, but I think once you're there, there's a public disclosure menu or drop down or button. And I would say, go there.
Very clean website, very easy to
Yes.
navigate.
Once you're there, I
Found it
think
very
you'll find
quickly.
it.
Yeah.
I hope.
Any other questions from our audience or from those on Zoom? Do we have one more Zoom question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Assuming the matching funds are not unlimited, how will they be equitably distributed?
So that's, if I understand the question correctly, I think it's like, how do you fairly figure out how much of an amount of matching funds a candidate should receive? And that is based on the number of eligible small donations that a candidate raises. So everything a candidate earns in public funds under the system is tied to their own fundraising among constituents in the community. So that's another reason. We've seen different models of public financing across the country, but one of the reasons why we're so enthusiastic about small donor match models, and particularly New York State's, is because the amount a candidate receives is fundamentally, it's tied to their own fundraising and engagement with constituents of the community. So candidates will get a match on those small contributions up to a limit based on the office that they're in. So per election, it's $3.5 million for statewide offices, $375,000 max for Senate per election, and $175,000 per election for Assembly. That's not to say every candidate will get that much. It's tied to their efforts in the community.
Yeah. So
I was just going to, I think I understood the intent of that question, which was more that if the bucket of money available is not big enough to satisfy all of the candidates that have met requirements, how can that be equitably distributed?
I see. So the program as it's designed, first of all, is a very cost-effective one. And under the projections, we think if, the Public Campaign Finance Board receives the funding that it has requested, that is more than ample to cover what we would project to be required under the program. But there are safeguards in the statute that created the law, just in the event that there would be a shortfall in a given cycle. So in that event, the comptroller would have the authority to draw from the general fund in order to ensure that there are ample funds. So candidates don't need to worry about it running out. But again, that's not something that folks want to rely on. So again, we do hope that we see in the budget that there is funding for matching funds in the program. Thanks for clarifying that.
Michael, did you have a follow-up comment? All right, it's all been said. Do we have any other questions from Zoom? The audience. Final question. All right. With that, I'd like to give a big round of applause to Hazel and Joanna. Thank you so much. Thank you to you all in the Brennan Center and to the Rockefeller Institute for having us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us here. We hope to see you at the next event.